Every big American city has a survival trick. When the suburbs boom, the city annexes them, swallows the new tax base, and keeps growing. Houston did it. Atlanta did it. Columbus did it. But one major city was legally forbidden to. Baltimore's borders haven't moved an inch since 1918, frozen by a single ballot question almost no one has ever heard of. So while every other city grew outward, Baltimore could only collapse inward. To understand the cage, you have to start with the line itself. Look at Baltimore today and your brain reaches for the wrong story. Boarded row houses with plywood eyes. Whole blocks where half the homes stand empty, their roofs caving slowly into the brick. The city has lost close to 40% of the people it once held. It reads like Detroit, like a place that industry abandoned and never came back for. But the cause here is almost the exact opposite, and that opposite is the whole point. When suburbs exploded across America in the 20th century, most cities had a defense against losing their middle class. They simply moved the city limits. If families fled to new neighborhoods on the edge of town, the city annexed those neighborhoods, pulled them back inside the boundary, and kept taxing them. The flight never really hurt, because the people who left were still paying into the same pot. The city followed its own residents outward like a net. Baltimore never got to throw that net. Its line was drawn and then it was locked, and it has not moved since the year the First World War was ending. Everyone else in America could chase their tax base across the map. Baltimore had to stand still and watch it walk away. That single difference, a border that could not move, is why this city became structurally unlike anywhere else in the country. But that frozen line only became fatal because of something the city did decades before it ever locked. The wound came first. The cage came later. And by the time the cage clicked shut, the damage that would fill it was already decided, because the map of Baltimore was drawn by race long before the borders ever closed. In 1910, a black Yale-trained lawyer named George McMechen bought a house on a white block in Baltimore. The neighbors did not respond with a mob. They responded with a law. The city passed the first racial residential segregation ordinance in American history, an actual statute making it illegal for black families to move onto white blocks and white families onto black ones. The city that would one day be famously boxed in by its own border started by drawing lines block by block, house by house, in city ink. Think about how strange that is. Other places enforced segregation with violence, with intimidation, with the quiet menace of who got served and who got chased off. Baltimore wrote it down. It made the color of a street a matter of municipal code, refined the language a few months later under Mayor J. Barry Mahul, and treated a man buying a home like a zoning violation. McMechen's house became a test case for whether a city could legally sort its people by race, address by address. For a few years, it held. Then in 1917, the Supreme Court struck these laws down in a case called Buchanan versus Worley, ruling that government could not tell you who to sell your house to. On paper, that should have ended it. The city had lost its tool. But losing the tool did not change the goal, and a government that wants to sort people by neighborhood does not give up because one method got banned. It just reaches for a quieter one. So the city switched weapons, and the next weapon left a mark you can still see from an airplane. In 1937, federal officials produced what was called a residential security map of Baltimore, grading every neighborhood from green at the top to red at the bottom. Green meant safe to lend in, red meant hands off. And the grading followed the color line almost perfectly because the people drawing the maps treated a black neighborhood as a financial hazard by definition. Banks read those maps and stopped lending. A red grade meant no mortgages, no improvement loans, no way for families to build the equity that turns a house into wealth. Think about what that quietly does over 40 years. In a green neighborhood, a family buys a home, pays it down, and watches its value climb into a nest egg they can borrow against, pass to their kids, or sell to move up. In a red neighborhood, that whole ladder is sawed off at the first rung. You cannot get the loan to buy, and if you somehow do, you cannot get the loan to fix the roof. So the house decays and the block decays with it, which only confirms the red grade for the next round of maps. The damage was invisible, drawn in colored ink in a back office by men who never set foot on the streets they were condemning. but it starved entire neighborhoods of money for generations and called it sound banking. Then the highway era hardened the ink into concrete. Planners proposed a road through West Baltimore that traces back to a 1944 arterial report by the famed builder Robert Moses, a report that openly noted the route would clear black neighborhoods, as if that were a feature. They built a piece of it straight through majority black West Baltimore. It leveled 971 homes, 62 businesses, and a school, and it pushed roughly 1,500 people out of the only neighborhood many of them had ever known. And here is the cruelest part. The highway was never even finished. It dead ends in the middle of the city, a wide concrete trench going nowhere, which is why people there call it the highway to nowhere. They tore out 1,500 lives for an off-ramp into thin air. Stack the segregation law, the redlining map, and the highway scar on top of one another, and a shape appears on the city. People in Baltimore have a name for it: the black butterfly and the white L. A spine of whiter, wealthier neighborhoods runs down the middle and out toward the harbor in the shape of an L, while two dark wings of disinvested, mostly black neighborhoods spread east and west like a butterfly pinned to the map. But redlining and ruinous urban highways happened in dozens of American cities, and if you like maps that explain why a place became what it is, subscribe, because that is the whole channel. Plenty of places got the maps and the bulldozers, so why is Baltimore the one that never climbed back out? The answer is a piece of paperwork from 1851 that almost nobody outside Maryland understands. Because of a quirk that old, Baltimore sits inside no county at all. It is an independent city, a place that is its own county equivalent, one of only 3 such cities in the entire country outside Virginia, the other 2 being St. Louis and Carson City. That sounds like a trivia answer. It is actually the whole machine. Here is what being countyless means in plain terms. A normal city sits inside a county, and the county spreads the cost of big expensive services across a wide base, including all the comfortable suburbs around the city. Baltimore has no county to lean on. It pays for everything: the schools, the police, the fire departments, the jails, the social services, entirely out of its own tax base, with no ring of suburbs sharing the bill. It carries a county's worth of responsibility on a single city's shoulders. Every other big American city that faced this exact squeeze solved it the same obvious way. Annex the suburbs. Pull the rich edges back inside the line, capture their taxes, and spread the cost across everyone the city actually serves. It is the move that kept dozens of American cities solvent through the hardest decades of the century. And the strange thing is that Baltimore did exactly that, annexing land again and again as it grew, right up until the moment it suddenly couldn't. Baltimore kept expanding its borders through 1918, grabbing surrounding land the way a healthy city is supposed to. Then came a vote so boring that the city barely looked up. In 1948, in the middle of the chaotic Dewey versus Truman election that had the whole country distracted, a dull little measure sat near the bottom of the Maryland ballot. It was called Question 5, pushed by a Democratic state senator from Baltimore County named William P. Bolton. And it changed one rule. From now on, any future annexation would require the consent of the people being annexed. Read that again, because it sounds reasonable, and it is actually a trap. It means that before Baltimore could ever pull a suburb back inside its line, the suburb itself would have to vote yes. And why on earth would a suburb ever vote to start paying city taxes? It never would. Nobody volunteers to raise their own tax bill. So the consent that Question 5 required was consent that would never, ever come. The line did not just stop moving. It was welded shut, and almost no one noticed the welding. The measure was so unremarkable that some of Baltimore's own legislators helped put it on the ballot. There was no great fight, no warning, no headline. The cage clicked shut by sheer indifference, on a day when the entire country was staring at a presidential race instead. Not 1 square mile has been added to Baltimore since 1918. Therefore, when the great suburban exodus came roaring through America a few years later, Baltimore experienced it in a way no peer city did. The same flight that Houston and Atlanta simply absorbed by growing outward became, for Baltimore, a drain that only ran one direction. Picture the frozen border as a valve that opens just one way. People could leave, money could leave. They crossed the line, bought a house a mile past it in the county, and took their property taxes with them. But the city could never follow. It could never reach across that welded line to recapture a single dollar of what walked out. Everyone who left still used the region, still drove the city's roads and worked near its harbor, but the bill for the city itself stayed behind with the people who could not afford to go. The numbers tell the rest. At its peak in 1950, Baltimore held 949,708 people and stood as the sixth largest city in the United States. By the 2020 census, it had fallen to 585,708, the lowest count in over a century, dropping all the way to around 30th in the national rankings. That is not a slump. That is a city losing the population of a mid-sized metropolis through a one-way door. And the drain feeds itself because a shrinking city with a county's worth of bills has to tax what remains harder and harder. Baltimore's property tax rate runs roughly double the rate in the surrounding county. Picture a young couple standing in two nearly identical row houses a mile apart, one just inside the city line and one just outside it in Towson or Pikesville. Same brick, same size, same commute. The one inside the line costs them thousands more every single year in taxes, year after year, for as long as they own it. There is no agonizing over that choice. They sign for the house in the county and they take their money across the border with them, which shrinks the city further, which raises the rate again, which pushes the next couple out. Each family that leaves makes the city a slightly worse deal for the family deciding next. The valve never closes and the spiral never stops. And every turn of it is just ordinary people doing the sensible thing with their own paycheck. This is where Baltimore separates from the Rust Belt story everyone wants to tell about it. Detroit shrank because the car industry collapsed and nothing replaced it. Pittsburgh shrank because steel died. Those cities lost their reason to exist and bled out. Baltimore's reason to exist never disappeared. It still has the harbor, the hospitals, the universities, the location. Baltimore did not bleed because its industry died. It bled because it was caged while everyone else got to run. But you have probably seen Baltimore sold as a comeback story, and that comeback has a very specific address. The comeback image is almost always the same glittering postcard, the Inner Harbor. In July of 1980, the developer James Rouse opened Harbor Place on a little over 3 acres of rotting wharf, a privately built festival marketplace of shops and restaurants and crowds and light. It was such a hit that cities from Barcelona to Sydney copied the formula. For a generation, it was the proof that Baltimore had turned the corner. So, success? Not quite, and the catch is brutal once you see it. The money that rebuilt the waterfront flowed almost entirely along the White L, the same spine of neighborhoods that the maps had protected and favored for decades. The investment hugged exactly the ground that redlining had graded green and bypassed exactly the wings of the butterfly that redlining had graded red. The glittering harbor and the hollowed-out neighborhoods sat a few miles apart and never touched. One Baltimore got a festival marketplace. The other Baltimore got the highway to nowhere. And the cruel coda is that by the 2000s and into the 2020s, Harbor Place itself was dying, its pavilions shuttering, the whole site now slated to be torn down and rebuilt again. The comeback that defined the city for 40 years could not even keep itself alive. So the real question is not how Baltimore fell, it is whether the box can ever be reopened. Here is the deeper problem. Can a city that was fragmented by law, by map, and by highway ever be made whole again? It is not a hopeless question because consolidation has worked in other places. Nashville merged with its county and grew. Indianapolis did it. Louisville did it. They erased the line between city and suburb, pooled the tax base, and got stronger for it. Research groups in Maryland have studied what a unified Greater Baltimore might look like, pulling the city and its suburbs back into one body. But every one of those merger plans crashes into the same wall, and it is the wall built in 1948. As long as city taxes run double the counties, the suburbs have no reason on earth to vote yes. Why would comfortable county residents agree to merge with a higher taxed, more burdened city and watch their own bills climb? They wouldn't. which is the exact logic Question 5 wrote into law in the first place. Undoing the cage would require the consent of the very people the cage protects. The suburbs hold the veto, and the veto says no. Therefore, the line still holds, just as it has for over a century. So here's the thing to carry out of all this. Detroit shrank because its industry died. Baltimore shrank because of a line drawn over 100 years ago that everyone except the city itself was allowed to cross. People crossed it. Money crossed it. Whole generations crossed it. The city stayed behind, holding a county's worth of bills and a few 100,000 people stranded on the wrong side of a border nobody can move. Every other city in America grew by crossing its own border. Baltimore is the one that was told it never could, and the line is still there tonight, exactly where they left it in 1918. Take a look at the videos on screen and drop a comment with the city you want explained next.